Heyo, Bolt here, and welcome to my first countdown. Well, technically second, but this one's commentary related. I love video games. I love boss battles. A lot of my favorite games of all time have amazing bosses I love to reface. Unfortunately, not every boss roster is full of hits. Even my favorite games have bosses I friggin' despise to face. So today, I'm going to count down my top 10 least favorite bosses from games I love. Now, let's set some ground rules. First, one per franchise and only from games I've played. That's obvious. And when it comes to how I rank them, the more I like the game, and the more my love for the game and my hatred for the boss collide, the higher on the list it will be. Now without further ado, let's burn through this! You know, I actually really enjoy Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. Heck, I'm in the minority where I actually prefer it over the original. I like the mission-based structure, I like the improved game mechanics that make catching ghosts feel more satisfying, and it keeps a lot of the charm of the original. That being said, the bosses are definitely worse here in general. Not always, I love the final two bosses, and the first boss was really fun, but enemy rushes always tend to suck, so the third world's boss wasn't really good, and Chili Ride is freaking obnoxious. Let's start with the first problem. Its design. It's literally just a monster face made of ice. And not even a cool way. It's the least inspired looking in the entire game, and this game has stairs as a boss! But that's the least of this boss's issues. Now let's talk about how you fight the thing. Normally, you have to use your surroundings or something on the boss itself to fight it. But here, we're thrown into a gimmicky first-person shooting section where you have to shoot bombs at the ice barriers before throwing it into the monster's mouth. What's the problem? The thing controls like ass. The bombs are very imprecise, and considering that A, the thing rebuilds its barrier if you don't hit it in time, which considering how small the pieces are is very possible, and B, you're on a time limit with the machine's temperature, these controls will screw you over very hard. Then after that, you have to suck the monster ghosts, as you usually do for these bosses, rinse and repeat until boss is defeated. The only reason that this isn't any higher is because while I like Dark Moon, I don't like it as much as later games on the list. But yeah, while I like Winter, it's not something I'd want to face head on. Pokémon Legends Arceus is a really fun game, as if my 100+ hours into the game, despite how young it is, doesn't say that enough already. And one of the cooler aspects of the game is actually the boss fights, which play a lot differently from your standard Pokémon game. The mix of skillful reflexes and turn-based combat is a really cool and unique thing for the series. Unfortunately, given the topic of the list, I had at least one boss I didn't like, and that so happens to be the last boss before the initial credits. My first problem with these bosses is obviously the design. Now, I don't hate how Palkia looks. The lack of arms is weird, but I think the horse look is fine for it specifically, and it definitely stands out to me more than the original Palkia design. But what the heck did you do to Dialga? I like the ideas for this form, but they just don't mesh well at all in 3D, especially compared to Giratina's origin form. But that's only my first issue. The next one is how underwhelming it is to actually fight. Most of its attacks are fairly standard and underwhelming, basically just being energy waves to dodge and Draco Meteors, and not much variation. When compared to the tough physical attacks of Arcanine, the change in perspective and tactics with Avalugg, and the hard as balls but infinitely more interesting Arceus, this just doesn't stand out. And it should, since it's technically the final boss of the main story. But I think my least favorite part of this boss is actually how hard it is to get your own Pokemon to fight this thing. The only way to bring your Pokemon out, to my knowledge, is by stopping their Scream Nuke, but the likelihood of you seeing this attack makes catching a shiny Pokemon look common. I genuinely never saw this when I first fought it, and it took me a while to actually find footage of it being used. And given this is an entire aspect of a boss in the game that you're just barring off, it makes the point of the finale, aka showing Kamado the true bond between Pokemon and humans, feel rather inconsequential. This boss isn't the worst thing ever, but in a spectacular game like Legends Arceus, this boss stands out like a sore thumb. Wait, what video am I recording for again? Kingdom Hearts is a series I always go back to when I think of bosses I really like, especially Kingdom Hearts 2. We have Xemnas, Roxas, Axel, Shanyu, Lingering Will, Twilight Thorn, the Hydra, Zigbar. God! So many amazing bosses! Unfortunately, not all KH2 bosses are made equal. I could have gone with Stamix for being a terrible spike in difficulty and also having that stupid time limit attack. I could also have chosen the Grim Reaper thanks to it being a gimmicky mess, but for this list, I'm going to go with Genie Jafar. Now I think some people might ask, why him? Aren't there worse bosses like the previously mentioned Demyx and Grim Reaper, as well as others like Ursula or Groundshaker? That's true, there were many different bosses I could have gone with. The reason I chose this one is because unlike the ones mentioned, this one is ungodly boring. In a game like KH2, being boring is the last thing you want to be, especially as a boss. And what makes it worse is that this boss had the perfect setup to be great. You're fighting Genie Jafar in the skies of Agrabah on the magic carpet. How could that not be cool? Simple. Have Jafar barely do anything. The only thing he does is summon lightning and fireballs to hit you, and sometimes tries to attack you physically, which is very easy to dodge. You have to stun his waist and hands in order to get an advantage, and after that, your reaction command is just spinning him around, which compared to riding a chandelier, taking out the Hydra's heads one by one, and cutting a building in half, this is remarkably lame. Oh yeah, he also has an invincibility form that's very easy to avoid the attacks of, and only serves to make the battle go on longer. I know KH2 has quite a few choices for boss battles, but Jafar barely beats them by being the most boring of the bunch. I quite enjoy Freedom Planet. It's a great indie game that takes what people love about games like Sonic and expands on them with some of the most progressive game design I've seen in a while. That being said, the Absolution is a boss I'd rather not fight again. The first problem is its repetition. It has only like, 2 attacks? Those being its lasers, and the second one being its flying attack where it tries to ram into you. Both do a crap ton of damage, which isn't helped by Freedom Planet's lack of invincibility frames, and the second attack can be quite hard to avoid. The second problem is its small weak point. It's small, and it's mostly only available when the laser attacks are being used, and it's really easy to get hit while attacking. Oh, and did I forget to mention you have to fight this thing twice? I know this entry is shorter than the previous one, but can you really blame me when the boss is this repetitive? God, forget this. Might as well just listen to a dream of an Absolution. At least then I'd get something of quality. Mega Man is one of my favorite video game series ever, which also means it's a gold mine of material for this kind of list. Where do I even start? Let's start with the Boom Trap from Mega Man 2, being a cheap puzzle boss that requires the Crash Bomb to kill. The Shadow Devil, being the worst iteration of the Yellow Devil that takes way too long to kill. And then there's Crystal Snail, a slow and agonizing boss if you don't have its weakness or know its exploit. All of these bosses would be good material for this list. However, I'm going to talk about a terrible boss from a game I prefer over all of the ones I've mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to the General from Mega Man X4. First off, this boss really likes to waste your time. It flying across the stage combined with how big the arena is can make it really hard to hit, and its attacks are so slow. It's agonizing waiting for its fists to move across the screen for you to hit, and there is no way around this. He is a complete drag. As X. As Zero, he's an absolute nightmare. Thanks to Zero's more melee-focused combat, hitting this guy is either asking to take damage or for the biggest drag in the entire game. Especially given how repetitive that makes the boss, since you're constantly just using the air spin to try and hit the thing. The boss manages to combine being both agonizingly boring and insanely frustrating, and the worst part is that this is still better than the bosses I already mentioned. God help me if I make a general least favorite bosses list. Fire Emblem Three Houses is an amazing game with amazing characters, great map design, and a great story. That being said, Azure Moon is probably my least favorite of the routes in the game. Far from bad. Dimitri is a great lord, and the story has so many great moments, but it often feels like some things can drag, and it has the least interesting finale in the game, at least in terms of bosses. You see, as we reach the end, Edelgard decides to power up, being trapped for forces, and okay, what the fuck is that? This thing is trying so hard to be disturbing, but it's the most hilariously dumb thing in the entire friggin' game. Like, seriously, when was something like this ever established to be able to happen? And how is Edelgard still alive by the time the ending starts? Doesn't a person die if they turn into a demonic beast? Is this thing even a demonic beast? This thing causes so many questions, and I'm only on its design. I can talk about the problems with the map itself, but for this list, I'll only be talking about the boss itself. In this form, Edelgard can shoot projectiles from far into the map. That sounds broken. Almost unfair, right? Yes. Yes, it would be if she didn't have the aim of a stormtrooper. I swear, these things only hit me like once or twice when I fought this thing. And it's just pathetic. And what makes it worse is how pathetic it is to take out this boss. Mechanically, it's just another demonic beast. And by this point, Byleth, Dimitri, and many other units are able to take it out with no problem. Compared to something like Nemesis, whose boss was more thought out thanks to how many steps it took to fight him, or Rhea, where in Crimson Flower at least, the fire created an interesting obstacle. This just doesn't come off as unique or interesting and just overall feels boring. I'm sorry if I say boring a lot, but that's usually a major turnoff for me in bosses. If I'm not at least gaining something interesting out of the boss, what's the point? Though I will assure you, the next few bosses are where things start to really get bad. Oh god, Sonic. There was a surprising amount of choices I could do for you. Sonic Mirage Saloon Act 1, Chaos 4, The Black Knight, so many choices. The Time Eater. I'm not even gonna hide it, it's the Time Eater. This boss is so widely talked about, it's hard to think of anything new to say about him, but I'll try my best. The first flaw with this boss is how it's hard to tell what you're doing half the time. I mean, sure, you can insinuate that you're supposed to get closer to him and attack his core, but the way the stage is designed, it makes it hard to tell how close you're getting. This is especially a problem given how rings are hard to come across, or get, thanks to Super Sonic's weird controls here. Next is the fact that Classic Sonic is almost useless in this fight. He can't really get closer and you could already get rings in the modern portions, so really, he's just pointless. Then there's the fact that he just slows down time. Just for no reason, even though he's slowed down too. So really, there's no point. And do I really even need to mention Sonic's friends assaulting your ears with useless information? Really, this boss is just confusing and even debatably luck-based. Sometimes it takes like half an hour to beat him, while others it can take like 3 minutes. This boss is such a disappointing end to one of my favorite games in the series, and definitely leaves a bad last impression. This number actually asks a very interesting question. What counts as a boss in a visual novel? Usually, these games have little to no gameplay and therefore no bosses. However, we do get those visual novels that have a more traditional game structure, and have moments that can be considered boss fights. In this case, Danganronpa, the bosses would be the rebuttal showdowns and the panic time action. But that also means that given I'm talking about a visual novel, I'm also gonna have to talk more about story. So, Mikan. Before now, I actually really liked Mikan. I found her cute and just wanted to give her the biggest hug thanks to what she's been through, and Hiyoko's constant bullying. That being said, Chapter 3 completely ruins her. I could go into so many reasons why DR2 Chapter 3 is so awful, and I probably will at some point in the future, but for now, our focus is on Mikan. Mikan was the culprit of Chapter 3, and the murderer of Ibuki and Hiyoko. You might think that it could be very interesting to think what would make the most timid character in the game kill. Maybe under stress of the situation, Mikan briefly snaps and killed Hiyoko. Nope, disease did it! Like, I get it.
'Cause it's a game!
But could you have made a worse motivation for a character in the series? Celeste had a better motivation, and hers was basically just,
we've got to have money.
And during the third trial, she becomes increasingly obnoxious. Not even in a good way.
I'm done with that! You hear me? I'm done!
But now it's gotten to the boss, and this thankfully still applies on a gameplay front because wow, I don't like this minigame. It's a rhythm minigame, and a bad one at that. It can be hard to try to keep up with the rhythm and figure out how you're supposed to break the shield. And all the while, you still keep listening to Mikan's annoying screams. Like, no disrespect to Stephanie Sheh, she's great as Mikan. But like say, The Black Knight, True Identity, and Sly 4, her rage as Mikan just isn't convincing, let alone pleasant to listen to. And as an extra bonus, she gets the absolute worst execution in the entire game, possibly the series. Overall, just an awful part of an awful segment of a game I adore. Remember the enemy rush battle from Sonic Heroes? Remember how they just made you face wave after wave of enemies as an excuse for a boss? Remember how those sucked? Well, imagine that, except it's a JRPG. That's basically Okumura from Persona 5. What happened here? In a game with so many cool and creative bosses, for the love of Yaldabaoth, why would you put an enemy rush as a boss? But okay, let's actually break this down. Kunikazu Okumura is the boss of Chapter 5 of Persona 5, aka the worst part of the game. I could also go over why this section of the game sucked, both from a story standpoint and a gameplay standpoint, but here we're talking about the boss. We're already at a bad start when the pre-battle cutscene sucks, having Morgana take away screen time and dialogue that should have gone to Haru. On a side note, play Persona 5 Strikers, Haru is really good in that. This is a really bad start. But then there's the boss itself. You think the first problem would be the arbitrary time limit, but nope, this has to be the most ineffective time limit I have ever seen. By the time you finish this boss, you'll have around 10 minutes, or heck, maybe even more. While I probably should be glad, it just makes me wonder why we even have it in the boss to begin with. Then we have the next problem, the enemies themselves. All the enemies are weak to a specific type of attack. The problem is that you're going to waste quite a bit of MP fighting them, and unless you have a few confidant skills or have a good variety of persona on Joker, there's no way to tell which elements you're going to need at first glance, which is only made worse by the fact that you can't do an all-out attack. And the final problem is, of course, the repetition. You do this for most of the boss. Then there's a bigger robot you need to beat, which can be just as annoying to face, especially with that super powerful attack. And after that, you just attack Okumura and he doesn't fight back and wait, that's it? Like, I get it, capitalist leaders are only as powerful as they are because of the people they abuse, something society metaphor. But I'm sure you could have done that while also making a good boss, and somehow Persona 5 Royal managed to make this even worse. I'm scared. Undertale is one of my favorite games of all time. I love the characters, I love the world, I love the lore, and I love the gameplay. The game also has a number of amazing bosses. However, the game is still familiar with having less great bosses. Undyne's pacifist boss is annoying thanks to how repetitive it can be. I was never really a big fan of Omega Flowey, and Muppet makes me want to jump down the mountain to my doom. Muppet was the very reason I decided to make this list, and for a good reason. She comes out of nowhere while you're still going through the Hotlands, completely disconnected from Metaton. But hey, that's the least of our problems. Each world had their own mid-boss. Muppet could have easily been the same. However, the actual boss design is really bad. Her boss introduces a new soul type. Purple makes it so you have to move between 3 lines. That's a cool concept, but the problem is how they use it. The acts are useless. One does nothing and the other keeps rising in price as you use it, so you might as well just keep doing nothing. And while they do warn you what kind of attacks come next, the attacks themselves are balls to dodge! From the spiders moving way too quick, to adding donuts into the equation, making it even more hectic and cupcake. This thing will chase you, and not only is it awkward to keep dodging while going up, but I swear, some of these attacks are unavoidable without insane luck. And you have to go through this for 17 turns. You have to deal with these attacks for quite a bit, and it's agonizing. The only good things about this boss are the music, seriously, Spider Dance is a bop, and the fact that you can skip them if you have an item from near the beginning of the game. But question, if you're always going to choose to skip the boss, what does that actually say about the boss design itself? This has been the Firebolt, and I hope you enjoyed my first attempt at a countdown.